our number today, but that doesn't mean we can't speak the truth, right? We're glad you're here. We are glad to have our visitors with us today. We're especially thankful for your presence. We do encourage you to stick around and give us an opportunity to visit with you and to come back and be with us at any opportunity that you might have. We have had a busy summer with a lot going on. We have just finished up our weeks of camp. We came back, several of us came back on Wednesday from the Upward Bound Adventure Camp. That is the last one that we were involved in for the summer. And it went very well. We thank everyone here for the role that we play here in making that possible. And we had a number of our kids as well as some of our adults that participated in that. And now school's just around the corner. Just in a couple of weeks, school starts back again, and we kind of get back into the roll of things once again. So we have a number of people who are away from us today, kind of in those last-minute vacation times. But we're just thankful to have moments like this when we can come together to worship God, to study His Word as a family. We're going to get right into our lesson this morning because we have been, of course, reading the Bible together as a family this year. We've been walking through the Old Testament thus far, and we have just finished through most of the prophets, and we've been walking through those. These murals depict the stories that we've been covering, and now we're kind of going back a little bit in the Old Testament, and this week we've read from Esther and Nehemiah, and we're going to be finishing up through this month. We're going to be finishing up the Old Testament and entering into the New Testament, and it has been a blessing to be able to read together as a family and then study together as a family from the things that we have read. Today we're going to consider a story and a book that to me is just one of the most beautiful stories in the Old Testament. The story of a woman by the name of Esther. Now, have you ever heard the saying, I was in the right place at the right time, or I was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Right? We all know those moments in our lives, right? Sometimes when we've missed an opportunity because we weren't where we wanted to be, or we may not have seen the opportunity that was presented to us. Other times when we were in the right situation and we were able to do something because of being in that right moment. Well, this morning we're going to walk through this remarkable story here in the Old Testament in the book of Esther. A story where God's providence is on full display, even though God's name is never actually mentioned in the book of Esther. God is referred to numerous times, but He's never actually mentioned, and yet it is a story that teaches us about the importance of seizing the moments that God gives us. Moments for which we might have been uniquely prepared for such a time as this. You see, the reality is that God works and moves in our lives continually. We have the regular mundane things that happen in life that God doesn't necessarily control. He lets the natural order of things happen. And yet God is there and God is present in everything. And so we're going to walk through the book of Esther. I encourage you to open your Bibles today. If you have your app on your phone, your church app, you can go to the notes section there, and the notes for this sermon are there. That will also give you access to the passages of Scripture as we read through them together. But if not, we encourage you to turn in your Bibles because we're not going to be having the readings on the screen this morning. But we want to pull from this book, from this story, three important truths about what we need to do in order to seize those moments for such a time as this. The first one we find in the first two chapters, and that it is important for us to see God's hand in the ordinary circumstances of life. And in the day-to-day situations in life, as I mentioned, God is at work in the mundane. And what seems to be the insignificant events in our lives. God doesn't necessarily cause those things, but God is still present. God is still at work in those things, areas of our lives. This morning, we were blessed during the Bible class hour to have Josh Blackmer speak to us. Josh and Kara work with the Macedonian Call ministry that they've been involved in, that we support here at Pleasant Grove Road. And Josh was sharing with us how the work has gone over the last year and their plans for the coming year. And the thing about that relationship that we now have with Josh and the fact that we're able to support and be a part of that ministry really started many years ago. I don't know how many years ago it was, but a long time ago, I met Josh at camp. Just at a regular week of camp. It was actually not a week that I was supposed to go to. I had a week that I coordinated, and then there was another week that was called Jenkins Week that they were short on staff, and they asked me to stay that year. And so I just stayed, and it was not anything that out of the ordinary, nothing spectacular. It was just a regular week of camp, and it was just the regular things that I do. And yet, I met Josh there. And that was the beginning of a friendship that formed the reality is that other than our faith, Josh and I honestly don't have a lot of things in common. I mean, we don't share a lot of hobbies. I would like to say I'm not a nerd. I'm just a different kind of nerd than Josh. And so we have different things that we like. We don't have a lot of those hobby things in common, and yet we have a love for God, and we have formed a friendship over the years. And what God has done is God has used Josh to weave in and around my life in just the right moments, in just the right ways. And Josh has had a way of just showing up in those moments in my life, and that has created a relationship that now has brought Josh here to allow us to be a part of the ministry that he and Kara are involved in and the work that they're doing, and we're blessed because we can be a part of what they're doing now. And it's all because of just normal things that happened in life where God used those moments to work and to move in our lives. We all have those moments. The moments that seem ordinary, but that lead to the extraordinary. And that's what we see in the book of Esther. So we're going to begin this morning in Esther chapter 1. Let's just look at the first two verses here because this kind of sets the stage or the scene. It starts off, it says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. So here you have this king. He is a king over a vast empire. It says he was king over 127 provinces that spanned this huge area of the globe. He was known to be one of the most powerful men in the known world of that day. And as you read on through chapter 1, what we find there is that King Ahasuerus, who was rather flamboyant and who likes to show off his wealth and his power, he holds a grand feast. This feast lasts for 180 days. And then after that feast, he has another one. He holds a 7-day banquet in the capital city of Susa. He invites all the prominent people there for this banquet. And during this final banquet and the final moments of it, the king commands his queen at that time, her name was Vashti, he commands the queen to appear before the guests so he could show off her beauty. Now, it doesn't specifically say it here, but the assumption is that this was more than just showing people her beauty, but probably to have her entertained in an inappropriate way. and the queen refuses. She does not come. And we won't go into all the details of the story, but as a result of her refusal, Queen Vashti is removed as queen and she is banished. She is sent away. And so now we have the king now looking for a new queen, which leads us then to, in Esther chapter 2, let's begin reading in verse 5. Esther chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, it says, "Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter." So there we're introduced here in verses 5 through 7 to Mordecai, who is a Jewish man who had been brought into captivity and brought into that area. It appears he had been put in a pretty prominent position of leadership. And he has with him a woman by the name of Hadassah, or Esther. Esther was his cousin, but she had been left without her parents, and so he helped to raise her and was basically treating her as his own daughter. Let's pick up in verse 8 and read verses 8 and 9. It says, "So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put into custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem." Now, as we read on there, we see that it went to a point where she eventually was put in the position of being queen, and was queen was the king's wife, or was his queen. And as we look at these circumstances, the reality is that for that time in that culture, this wasn't that extraordinary. It was unique that she was picked out of a lot of people and brought into this situation. And yet, this was common for that culture. This is what they did. And yet, these ordinary circumstances set the stage for God to do extraordinary things. Esther, a Jew, becomes the queen of a Gentile empire. And it sets the stage for God's hand to be seen. Out of these ordinary moments that Esther would not have thought anything about, Mordecai would not have thought anything about, and yet God positioned the situation for such a time as this. Here on the screen, I have just a series of random dots. These dots represent just the ordinary moments in our lives. Ordinary moments that we go through in our lives, that some good, some bad, but just the typical things that we deal with in our lives that in and of themselves, they don't make a lot of sense, right? We look at these moments and we can't really make anything out of them. It's just part of life. But then God starts connecting those dots. God starts putting all of these things together. And as we look at what God does, He starts putting all these things together, and they start to make sense, and we start to see God's hand in our lives. We start to see God moving in our lives. And then God even further, and he colors in all of those lines. God brings everything together, and he makes all those ordinary moments in our lives something that is extraordinary. When we look at all those individual dots, they don't really make a lot of sense. But when we allow God to put all those moments in our lives together, it turns from just ordinary moments into something amazing. The Apostle Paul says it this way in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. He says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things," all of those dots in our lives, "all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." You see, what Paul says is we take all of those things in our lives, the good and the bad, the stuff that doesn't make sense, the stuff that we don't understand. We take all of those moments, and God will use those moments for our eternal good if we just love him and trust him. And so the question this morning is, how often do you overlook the ordinary moments in your life, and without realizing that God's hand is in every one of them? God is moving. God is working in our lives. You know, we have a tendency to pick and choose when we think God has control. If we do something good, if we achieve something, for example, I graduated with my master's degree about a year and a half or so ago, and look at me. Look at what I did. Go Bill. I got pretty good grades. I did well. I look at me. And then I lose somebody in my life that I love. And why did God do that? Why did God take that person from me? Or I lose my job, and why did God do that to me? Our personal achievements, suddenly they're all about us, right? And then anything that is bad, suddenly God had a hand in it. And God played a role in it. The reality is, God allows the natural order of things to happen in this life, both the good and the bad, but God's hand is moving in all of it. He is working in our lives. He is placing us there in ways where we can serve him, and he will do amazing things in our lives if we will let him. But in order for that to happen, we've got to recognize our role in the moment. We've got to see the role that we play in those moments in life where we're called. And it might be in crisis. It might be in moments where we're called to stand. But you see, these moments often reveal the need for someone to step up. And God often places us in positions where we can be that person to step up and do what he's called us to do. Let's go back to the story here of Esther. King Ahasuerus, in the process of all the things that he was doing, he promoted a man by the name of Haman to a high position of authority. Now, Haman was just a bad dude in general. He was not a good guy, and Haman, he did not like the Jews at all. Haman made a decision that he was going to orchestrate situations to get rid of the Jews out of the land, and began this process to do that. And let's, with that in mind, pick up in chapter 3. We're going to read verses 8 and 9. Esther chapter 3, beginning of verse 8, it says, "Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, 'There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. And their laws are different from those of every other people. And they do not keep the king's laws. So that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those And he pulls from this playbook. This is a standard playbook when you want to get control, and that is make enemies. Create enemies. So he creates an enemy in the Jews. And I've often wondered, we look back to Germany leading up to World War II and how Adolf Hitler created an enemy of the Jews. And the things that Adolf Hitler said are very similar to the things that Haman said. And I've often wondered if maybe Adolf Hitler didn't read his Bible a little bit more than we thought that he did. But Haman pulls from that playbook. And he goes to the king and he says, King, you need to know about these people. They're trouble. They're scattering themselves out among all the people. They're dispersing themselves all over the kingdom. You look, they're everywhere. And they're following their own set of laws. They're not obeying you. They're becoming a problem because they're disrupting the kingdom. And so Haman not only asked the king to make a decree to get rid of the Jews, but he basically tells the king, if you do this, I'll pay you money to do this. I'll make it financially worth your while. Let's skip over to chapter 4. And because in verses 1 through 3, we have now, the king has passed this decree. The Jews have heard of this law that has come about, Mordecai specifically. And it says, beginning in verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So here you have Mordecai. He recognizes the dire situation of his people. And so what Mordecai does is he just throws up his hands and says, well, there's not much I can do about it. It is what it is. It's going to be what it's going to be. It's probably not going to be that bad. Is that what Mordecai did? No. Mordecai went into mourning, but he didn't just go into mourning. He went into public mourning. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he began to wail and to lament, to weep. And he did it publicly. He went into all the public places, even to the gate, the king's gate. He went, and so that everyone could see and everyone could know what was happening. You see, they didn't have the ability to put it on the news or to send out a tweet. So his way of getting the word out of what was going on was to just cry it out everywhere that he went. You see, what he did was he seized an opportunity. He didn't just ignore what was happening. He didn't just throw up his hands and say, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm just a guy, just a man. Mordecai seized that moment to do what he could do. The reality is we see moments like this all throughout Scripture. Nehemiah, we read from Nehemiah this week, and Nehemiah heard about the broken walls of Jerusalem. And he was moved to rebuild them. Nehemiah said, I need to seize this moment. I need to do something. A couple of months ago, we read about Moses as he encountered the burning bush and was called to deliver Israel from slavery. Moses tried to ignore the moment, but God wouldn't let him. And Moses finally rose up to do the hard things, to seize that moment for such a time as this. The message this morning is that we are also called to recognize the needs around us. The spiritual needs, the physical needs, the emotional needs, and to consider our role in addressing those moments. You know, it's often tempting to just ignore them. We find ourselves doing that all the time. We see an issue and we try to look the other way because if I don't see it, if I don't address it, it doesn't exist. But it does. Those moments are still there. How many times have we as Christians witnessed and known about sin going on within the church family, and we've just looked the other way? How many times have we seen a need? Someone who is struggling, someone who needs help, and we've gone to the other side of the street? How many times have we seen moments where we can help, but we choose not to? Mordecai saw a need. And the first step to doing anything is acknowledging our place in that moment. Our place, or the role that we play in helping and serving and meeting needs. Which leads us to the final point as we come into Esther chapter 4, and that is that we are called to step out in faith and to be courageous. You see, stepping out is not for the faint of heart. It takes courage. And seizing the moment often requires that courage, especially when it involves personal risk. But you see, God's call on us is greater than the fears that we face. We see this as we finish the story here in Esther. Let's look at Esther chapter 4 and verse 8. It says, "And he, Mordecai, sent her, Esther, a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him for her people." So Mordecai sends word to Esther. He shows her the decree, the law that called for the destruction of the Jews. And he offers a direct challenge to Esther. Notice it says here that he commanded her to go. This wasn't a request. Mordecai, as her cousin, as one who though had raised her as his child, commanded her. He said, "You must do this. You must go and try to save our people. You've got to go and petition the king." Let's skip down to verse 11. It says, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know," this is Esther speaking, "know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being summoned, there is but one law: to be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Esther says, "Mordecai, you don't go into the inner courts of the king unless you've been asked to go into the inner courts of the king." That is a death wish to do that. If I do that, I'm basically writing my own death sentence. That would make no sense for me to do that. You see, what Esther's wanting to do here, she's wanting to just ignore the problem. She's hoping someone else will step up. She's hoping that someone else will take care of this. She doesn't want to take the risk. But then let's pick up in verse 13. It says, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, 'Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai sends word to Esther, and he says, Esther, if you don't go to the king, eventually somebody else will. God's going to make sure that his people are saved. But it's probably going to be too late for you and for your family. It's probably going to be too late for me. And then he goes on to say to Esther, Esther, who's to say that God did not put you in this position for just this moment? For just this time. Who's to say that God did not put you here for such a time as this? I think back to moments in my life where there have been people in my life at just the right moments. I think back to moments of tragedy in my life, and I won't recount them because I would not get through them right now. But I think back to some moments of tragedy in my life when, if it had not been for certain people, Josh and Kara, Mike Feeser, all three of our elders, to be honest with you, if it hadn't been for certain people who were just in the right place at the right time to get me through those moments, I don't know where I would be today. And I believe with all my heart that those people rose to the occasion for such a time as this. The moments I needed them, they were there. But you see, it wasn't Josh, it wasn't Mike, it wasn't all the other many people I can mention. It was God. God was there holding my hand. God was there crying with me. God was there giving me strength. It was God doing it, using these people that were there for such a time as this. And so Mordecai says to Esther, Esther, don't you think it's possible that God put you in this place for this very purpose? And that leads us to the final passage we want to read this morning, and that is verse 16 of Esther chapter 4. Because this is Esther's response, and it's a beautiful one. She says, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther says, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. God's put me here for this purpose. We're going to move forward. But then she notices she calls all the people to basically petition God on her behalf, to spend time in fasting and to petition God for her. And then she says, when all that's done, I will go, and whatever happens, happens. In other words, I'm simply going to trust God. And so that leads us to the real question this morning, and that is, what inner courts are you afraid to enter? What challenging situation, what risks are you unwilling to take for the sake of God's kingdom? We have to remember Mordecai's profound question. Who knows whether you have not been put here in this situation for such a time as this. It might be someone that you know who's living in sin that needs someone to just come to them and love them and call their attention to what they're doing. Who's to say God hasn't put you here for such a time as this? It might be a family, a husband and a wife that you know who are going through struggles, and it might be easy for you to look the other way, and yet it may take you stepping up and saying, hey, let me walk with you through this valley that you're in. Who's to say you haven't been put here for such time as this? It might be a particular area of ministry that you have a heart for, but you haven't up to this point been willing to take the risk to possibly sacrifice your job or sacrifice your finances or whatever. Who's to say that you haven't been put in this place for such a time as this? Could it be that your current circumstances, your unique gifts, your specific connections, all of these things have prepared you for a specific moment for such a time as this? As we go through the rest of the story, and it's depicted here on this last mural, Esther goes to the king. She enters into the inner court. She steps out in faith. And of course, there's a series of things that happen as a result, but ultimately what it means is that the Jewish people are saved. Haman loses his life, but the Jewish people are saved. And it wasn't the king that did it. It wasn't Esther that did it. It was God who did it. God did it, and he used Esther as his instrument. You see, the story of Esther is a powerful reminder that God is always at work, even when we don't see it. Even when we don't understand it. Take your minds back to that dot to dot on the screen. We have all these moments in our lives that when they're all by themselves, they don't make a lot of sense. And yet God works and moves. And he may not always intervene in our circumstances, but he does use our circumstances, our gifts, and our opportunities for his ultimate purpose, for such a time as this. Our call this morning is to be like Esther, to have the courage to seize the moments that God has given us, to recognize that we are called to rise up in faith, and even when we know that there's going to be risk, even when we question how it all is going to work out, that we trust God, that we do what he has called us to do. I am approaching my 5th year anniversary with this congregation. And on August 1st, I will have been working with PGR for 5 years. It's kind of hard to believe because in some ways I feel like I just got here. But one of the things that I have always done in ministry is I've kind of charted out a plan. And it's always been the first 3 years are just getting to know the congregation. Just getting to know and develop a trust and a relationship with the congregation. And then the next couple of years are about really forming that relationship, developing the talents and the abilities, and charting a path forward. And then year 5 is really about stepping out. In the coming year, in 2020 and 2026, if God gives us that time, we're going to be really looking at ways that this family can step up and step out in faith and do things that we could never imagine that we could do on our own. God has called us to win Citrus County, to win the Nature Coast, to win the world for him. And we can do that with God's help. God will do it, but he will use us. But guess what it means? It means we've got to rise up, seize the moment, and recognize that we are here for such a time as this. Do you accept that call? Are you ready to take that step? Are you ready to seize that moment and watch God put all the dots together, to connect all the dots together and color them in, and show us what He will do through us for such a time as this? Let's accept that call. Let's accept that challenge to be the people, to be the church that He has called us to be. If you're subject to the invitation,